Welcome to everybody. This is um, part of Oxford University's What Economists Really Do sessions that we have. Our speaker today, who I'll introduce in a second, is Alex Kohlhas. Alex, like me, is a macroeconomist, and therefore, what economists really do is what most people think economists really do. So a lot of us think about things like interest rates, inflation, and that's going to be the discussion today is really going to be about expectations, behavioral macroeconomics, and in particular linking it to the resurgence of inflation that we saw as we emerged from the COVID pandemic, and sort of ask a few questions about what we can understand of it, not just from the point of view of macroeconomics, but from the point of view of behavioral macroeconomics. So very quickly introducing Alex. Alex is an associate professor in the department. He's also a tutorial fellow at St. Edmund Hall, or Teddy Hall, for those of you who like the colloquial terms. Alex did his PhD in Cambridge, but we don't hold that against him at all. And he, before coming to us, he actually worked in Stockholm. And yeah, I will just say that Alex is a colleague of mine for the last years, but actually was someone who I had initially tried to hire when he was first on the job market. So I was delighted I eventually got him as a colleague here in Oxford. Alex, you have about 40 minutes or so, and then what we'll do is we'll have a Q&A session where I'll ask some questions and I'll ask some questions that come from the audience. People in the audience, if you want to ask questions, there is a Q&A function. If you pop your questions in there, then we will put them to Alex either at the end or if there's opportune moments throughout where he pauses. Otherwise, Alex, over to you.
All right, yeah, so thank you very much. Yeah, so my name is Alexandre, and this is going to be about the rise of inflation and behavioral macroeconomics. It's back. So what I plotted here on this chart for you is the developments of headline inflation, so CPI inflation, change year over year for the G7 economies, so the 7 largest industrial economies, Western industrial economies in the world. And what we see from this picture is that recently we've gone through one of the largest economic shocks that we have had in recent history, and it is the return of inflation. So in the post-2000 period, inflation was relatively stable and well anchored at around 2%. And what we see is that following the COVID-19 shock, inflation increased from not only kind of like standard levels from standard levels of around 2% to around 7.5% in annual terms for most of the advanced economies. Now this picture here is done at an annual frequency, right? So it masks a little bit the total rise in inflation. Okay? So for a lot of the countries, including the UK, inflation actually hit 10, 11%, inflation rates that we had not seen since the late 1970s, early 1980s. Now, this rise in inflation, was also kind of heavily tilted towards specific sectors in the economy. Okay? So what I plot on this picture here is a picture I've taken from a financial news provider, from Yahoo, and they basically provided the total change in headline inflation from the start of 2022 to October 2022. And what we see is the total inflation rates here in green. These are these numbers similar to the previous slide, like 10, 11, 12% for a lot of countries. And then we see it broken down into what was the rate of increase in food price inflation and energy price inflation. And what we see is, firstly, that the rise in food price inflation, kind of just like core staple goods we all need to eat, were in many countries substantially larger. In Germany, for instance, it was close to 20%. Whereas the rise in energy prices, some energy prices, like energy prices in the country that I currently live in, the UK, rose by more than 50%. Okay? So certain sectors experienced substantially larger increases in the prices of certain goods, in particular energy and food, goods which are really kind of fundamental to human life. So also just to show you a little bit about how unusual this experience is, this is a picture that I've taken from a presentation by Ricardo Rice at the LSE. And what he plotted is basically 20-year inflation rates. The Bank of England has this 800 years of inflation in the UK. And we basically have these 800 years of inflation from 1217 to 2016. And what we see is that the recent period that we went through, from roughly the end of the 2000s to 2016, we had extremely stable inflation, and it was right bang on the central bank target rate of around 2%. Okay? Now, the inflation rates that we've seen, the kind of 10% inflation rates that we've seen, even in the broad context of these 800 years of inflation, they're completely outside of the picture. Okay? That doesn't mean that in some of these 20-year periods we didn't see inflation that high, but it just shows that inflation was really very unusually high. Okay? This was unusually high, and it's so far also been unusually persistent. Even if we look at inflation rates today, they're uncomfortably above central bank target rates in countries like the UK. Okay. Now, when you look at such a big change in inflation, one natural question is, should we care? And there are indeed many economic consequences of having a very large rise in inflation. Okay? The first one is just that it leads to arbitrary relative price distortions. Okay? So when consumers are choosing how much to consume, suddenly things don't align up. Right? Suddenly you could get like 1,000 megawatts of electricity for one banana, and suddenly that trade-off is wrong. So you need to re-optimize on how many bananas and how much electricity you need to consume. Okay? On the other hand, there's also arbitrary redistribution of wealth, depending on whether you hold fixed or nominal assets, real or nominal assets. So there is redistribution of wealth, and there's often a very large associated increase in the rise of inequality, right? As some households that hold real assets, are not hit as badly as poorer households often that only hold nominal assets and often hit much more adversely by these large rises in food and energy prices. And then finally, when inflation rates are that high, they also tend to be quite volatile. And therefore, there's quite a lot of uncertainty about what is the real rate of return of my investment, or what is the real rate of return of postponing consumption. So these are just some of the economic consequences of a rise in inflation. And overall, if we look through the broad span of history, we note that there have been very large macroeconomic costs of having high inflation rates. Okay? Weimar Republic, Germany, the oil price OPEC shocks of the 1970s, and also the period that we've gone through now, have had relatively large macroeconomic costs of having these very large rises of inflation. Okay? These are kind of like economic costs. Okay? Then there are also societal costs. Okay? There's this kind of famous quote that inflation is corrosive to the fabric of society. And if you look at things like political, like how polarized the political situation is, you will see that inflation matters a lot. Inflation is really something which drives voters out to vote for change. And sometimes change can be diversive and sometimes change can be good, but it at least drives change. Inflation is something that affects almost everyone. And it can often really change the makeup of society. So now, what drove this increase in inflation is still a somewhat kind of debated topic, okay? But there were at least kind of three features which seems to have driven the overall rise in inflation. The first was kind of like what we would now view, having had more observations, as excessively expansive demand-side policy. In response to COVID-19, there was a large increase in fiscal stimulus, and some of this fiscal stimulus ex post seems to have been excessive. On the other hand, there was also kind of a slightly misdiagnosis of how transitory or how large certain supply side shocks and bottlenecks created by COVID-19 were. Okay? There was some idea that these supply side shocks would abate very quickly and wouldn't have a large impact on inflation, where really these supply side shocks caused by the COVID-19 crisis ended up having very long lasting impacts and ending up having raising inflation to very elevated levels for a prolonged period of time. And then finally, there was also perhaps some misdiagnosis about what exactly the duration of this energy price shock was, which led monetary policy to be kept low for too long, and also led the demand side conditions to be too loose for too long. Okay? So Ricardo Reis has this idea of there were three mistakes in a row, okay? But at least all of these factors contributed, this confluence of factors contributed to whether inflation increased in the first place and to the extent to which it increased. Okay? So excessively expansive demand side policy, misdiagnosis of supply side shocks and bottlenecks, and then also just a misdiagnosis of the duration of the energy price shocks, which followed the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, whether inflation, once it's risen to these levels, is here to stay or not, is really a question not only of how quickly these shocks abate, but also the extent to which these past inflation rates get embedded into people's expectations. And if we look at central bank worries, one of the main worries is that this rise in inflation has led people to incorporate higher inflations into their expectations, demanding, for instance, then higher wage increases, which leads firms to marginal costs to be higher, leading to higher inflation, which would again then lead to higher expected inflation, and so on and so forth. So the question of whether inflation is really here to stay, whether we're going to live now with 3-4% inflation rates rather than 2% inflation rates, is to a large extent a question about whether inflation changes impact people's expectations, and to which extent these expectations then affect real economic outcomes. So what I want to talk for the rest of what I want to spend the rest of this time that we have here today on is to talk a little bit about how recent models of expectation formation have changed a little bit the view that we have on the expectation formation process, how households and firms form their beliefs, and what that can inform us about how we should view this shock to inflation going forward. So first of all, this is just a picture here showing you that inflation expectations do indeed change. So if you ask my mom what is expected inflation, my mom has this tendency to always answer 2%, and it's almost irrespective of the actual rate of inflation. My mom has this like God-given faith in the central bank, that central bank beliefs are always 2%. But the rest of the world is not like her. So what I've plotted here is the distribution of household inflation expectations 1 year ahead from the Michigan Survey of Consumers. And we've done it in 2020, 2021, and April 22. And what we can see is that the distribution A shifts to the right. So there are more people that have higher inflation expectations. Okay? And the other thing that we can see is that the people who expect these tail events, people who expect extremely high rates of inflation, have also increased substantially. Okay? So the share of people who expect inflation to be north of 10% 1 year ahead has also increased substantially. Okay? So the distribution of expectations do indeed change in response to realizations of economic shocks. But the question is how, and what is the connection then to people's actions? So at a broad level, why are expectations important? Well, expectations are important because they affect almost all economic choices that we can think about. So if we look at a household who decides how much to consume, a firm that has to decide what price to set, or a firm deciding how much to invest, the choices that determine the size of macroeconomic fluctuations almost always depend upon people's expectations of what's going to happen in the future. This in turn means that it's very important, if we want to have models which are consistent with the data, that we have correct models of expectation formation. And if we look at the history of macroeconomics, we have often had very many different models of expectation formation. So we've gone from kind of naive adaptive learning rules to the full information rational expectation revolution of the 1970s, to today maybe some more behavioral, psychologically well-founded models of expectation formation. But the trouble is that if we look at each of these different models, they're going to have very different implications for the cost benefits of different economic policies, and hence for what we believe to be the best policy to take at any given moment in time. That we want is that it's data consistent. So it's consistent with the data that we have and how people form their expectations. But it also needs to be sufficiently portable. It's a model that's supposed to be sufficiently simple to these big macro frameworks have, and actually do policy counterfactuals that we can actually analyze what's going to happen with the economy. So here's kind of one example that we can write down, which we can use to think about how an economic agent makes a decision. Okay? Now, suppose that we have some economic agent, a firm, right? And this firm, what it wants to do is it wants to maximize the net present value of its future payoffs, in this case, profits. Beta, and it's going to have some payoffs, which are going to depend upon some states, YT, some choices it's already made, and some choices that it's going to make. Okay? And these payoffs here are going to matter for the decision maker. And this could be a firm or it could be a household. Okay? But the choice is dynamic. Okay? So when a household makes a choice today, it's also going to think about what's going to happen tomorrow and what's going to happen 2 periods from now. In this case, in fact, what's going to happen for the whole infinite history of time. Now, when a household makes this decision that it makes, it needs to think about not only, what do I expect about the future? So what is actually my expectation? So that's what we're going to call this object F. What's the household's forecast of its future payoffs in different states? And what information do I have? And we're going to summarize all of the information that the decision maker has in this information set omega. And we're going to call the expectation that the household has, the forecast that she has, we're going to call that F. And the question is really, what properties of F should we have? How should F be constructed? And what frictions are going to affect how F is going to be determined? How is F actually going to be set in real life? And once we have this model of expectations, then we can go ahead to the machine and says, okay, solve this dynamic, horrible problem. And it's going to give us a set of choices that are going to be made. And then we can go and contrast those choices with actual economic outcomes. Okay? So that's like the canonical problem. But the properties are really, the questions that we're really asking is what properties should expectations have, and what frictions are going to affect how these expectations are determined. So if we go back across time, we can kind of see that in macro, we've kind of had different approaches to this. So kind of pre-1970s, pre what we're going to call the rational expectation revolution, models of expectations were extremely simple. They're what were called naive adaptive or extrapolative rules. Right? And there are rules of the following form. That, my expectation today, my forecast of inflation tomorrow would just be some coefficient times inflation today. So the most naive model is kind of a model of extrapolation. Okay, so my expectation today of inflation tomorrow is just going to be what inflation was yesterday. So that's when this coefficient here, alpha, tends towards 1. Okay? Now you can put some coefficient not equal to 1. You can put some coefficient like 0.9. But what matters is just that expectations are purely backward looking. My expectation about the future is just some coefficient about what inflation is today. Now, this kind of very simple framework, right? It's very simple, right? So that is an advantage, right? We can very easily build this into our models. So that's a main advantage. The second advantage is it naturally creates a lot of persistence, right? So if inflation is high today, people are going to expect inflation to be high in the future. Therefore, they're going to set high prices, and therefore inflation is actually going to be high in the future. So the economy is going to go through these persistent swings which you kind of see happening in the data. Now, there are also some perceived costs of having such a very simple model, okay? The perceived cost, number one, is that when we look at data on how people form their beliefs, this does not look very much like the best model that we can write down of expectation formation. And it's also non-micro-founded in the sense that it cannot address questions like, where does this alpha parameter come from? What happens if we change this feature of policy? Will it change how people form their beliefs or not? And if so, by how much? These are questions that we cannot address in this framework where future inflation, expectations of future inflation are just some coefficient times inflation today. So in 1961, there was a paper by Muth in Econometrica, which is a famous journal for economics, that advanced this notion of the rational expectation hypothesis. And what Muth did is he looked at survey evidence on how firms form their expectations, and he noted two things. The first thing he noted is that if we average the firm forecasts in the survey, they are more precise than any individual forecast. So if we took a bunch of survey forecasts, we averaged them, what we got out was substantially more accurate than any of the individual forecasts. So that's exactly like in Galton's cow guessing contest, how much does a cow weigh? The average did much better than any individual forecast. And the second thing that he noticed was that these forecasts were substantially less volatile than the realizations. Okay? So when we had the realizations of inflation, they're all over the place, but the forecasts were much smoother. Now, what he said was, I can actually write down a very simple model of this, which is going to be consistent with these two features of the data. And it's the following model. An individual person I's forecast at time t of inflation tomorrow is just equal to their mathematical expectation of inflation tomorrow, given this signal of inflation tomorrow. But note that this signal here of inflation tomorrow, SIT, is equal to pi t plus 1. So it's a signal of inflation tomorrow, plus some error term here, which is idiosyncratic. It has an I subscript. Okay? So people don't fully see inflation tomorrow. They have some noisy signal of what inflation is tomorrow. Okay? And because they have this noisy signal of what inflation is tomorrow, when we take averages, we're going to get a more precise forecast. Okay? Because you may erroneously get some signal that inflation is going to be too high. I may erroneously get some signal that inflation is going to be too low. So when we average it, we're going to be much more spot on than any of the individual forecasts. Okay? And secondly, because this signal here is noisy, because neither of us perfectly know what inflation is going to do, right? We're going to not update our expectations completely because we know that we receive noisy information. So our expectations are going to move by less than actual realizations. Forecasts are going to be less volatile than actual realizations. Okay? So what Robert Lucas did, who was a Nobel laureate in macro, he used this idea to show why monetary policy indeed matters for the economy in the first place. And it led to what's called the rational expectations revolution, this idea that we can just equate people's forecasts with their mathematical expectation. Okay? So this here are basically people following Bayes' rules, forming optimal expectations in this sense. And we're equating individual forecasts with these optimal kind of expectations. Now, shortly thereafter, there were already people who noted some kind of methodological problems with this. Okay? I just told you there exists this information out there, which is noisy, and maybe you receive a signal that inflation is too high, I receive a signal that inflation is too low, but where in fact does this inflation come, where in fact do these signals come from? And what Bob Townsend noted in a very influential paper is that these signals often come from market interactions. So most of the information that I see about the state of the economy are market outcomes. There are, for instance, the prices of a bottle of water that I just bought, or a GDP release, or there's some sequence of market outcomes that I observe, and I then use these observations of market outcomes to form my model of expectations. And what Bob Townsend noted very quickly is that, that creates a problem once you have these noisy signals, that there are sort of mathematical issues related to this that are going to cause these kinds of models to be very hard to use in real life. And the second question is, how should we calibrate the amount of noise that exists in people's information? How noisy is your perception of information relative to my perception of information? Now, one simple solution to this is to just remove this noise term altogether. Okay? So let's suppose that we were agents in the economy and we were forming these expectations, which were correct according. We were doing this, forming these mathematically correct expectations. But instead of observing some noisy signal of inflation, then we just observed everything which happened in the economy at all moments in time. Okay? Now, if you do that, we have what was called full information rational expectations. And in that case, your expectations are just formed mathematically, they're formed correctly, using Bayes' rule, but we condition here on observing everything that has happened to the economy at all moments in time. This is, again, like the first model. It's a slightly more complicated model of expectation than these naive backward-looking models, but it's also highly tractable. This is a model, because we know how to use Bayes' rule, we can easily compute mathematical expectations. This is a model that we can use in many different circumstances, in many different macro models, to analyze many different questions, such as, why is inflation so high today? Okay. Now, more recently, post the financial crisis that we also saw, in 08, there's been a question about whether this is not a flawed approach, whether this simplification is really accurate to use. Ultimately, this is a simplification which buys us some analytical tractability. So it's a simplification, it's going to fail. And the question is whether its failures are kind of quantitatively important for macroeconomic dynamics. And post the financial crisis, the view that maybe that this is indeed the case has kind of shifted, and more people are starting to think that maybe indeed this could be the case. So let's try to look a little bit at how we can use data to help say that this model of expectation information is maybe not the right one, and what we could do about it. Okay. So what I've defined here at the top of this slide is an individual agent's forecast error of inflation. So it's the difference between realized inflation tomorrow, IT plus 1, and my forecast, I'm individual I, at time t of inflation tomorrow. Okay. Now, if I use any signal x correctly, it cannot be that there's a systematic correlation between the forecast error that I just created and that signal. Why? Well, suppose that there was some correlation, then I could use that information. Correlation is basically information. I could use that relationship to improve my forecast, contradicting the assumption that my forecast was the conditional expectation to start with. Way to write this, right? Conditional expectation of the forecast error, conditional on that signal that I said x, that has to equal to 0, there can be no additional information from the signal, for instance, output, the price of the water, the bottle that I just wrote, that could help me predict my forecast error tomorrow. Okay. Now, this is a very strong prediction, right? Because it tells you this number should be 0. So whatever signal that you have, we shouldn't be able to predict your forecast error of inflation with it. Okay. So we can do two things. Okay. So the first thing we can say is, okay, well, if you're forecasting inflation, maybe you observed inflation in the past. Okay. So suppose I just directly take your forecast error and I regress it on past inflation realizations. Okay. So I regress it on inflation in the past. What would happen? Okay. And under full information rational expectations, this coefficient here, gamma, should equal 0. You should not be able to predict your forecast errors from realization of inflation if you're really just trying to forecast inflation and keeping a track of it. The second thing is that, if everyone observes everything, everyone also observes, they all have common information, and the change in the forecast of inflation tomorrow from today to yesterday, the average change in the forecast should also not correlate with a person's in forecast error. Okay? So if we look at our average change in our forecast of inflation in 2025 from today, and you polled us also a year ago, that change should not be able to predict individual forecast errors. So if we look at these kind of linear relationships between a person's forecast error and the average forecast revision and a person's forecast error and past inflation realizations, then these coefficients delta and gamma should actually be equal to 0. Okay? So these are predictions that we can just go test in the data. We can go look at how people form expectations, and we can see how if these predictions are indeed true. Okay? And indeed, we can even, instead of looking at how people on average change their inflation forecasts, we can also look at it just at the individual level. So that's this coefficient beta here. That's going to look at the relationship between individual forecast errors and individual forecast revisions. And under full information rational expectations, these coefficients gamma and delta and beta should equal 0. Okay? This is a very strong prediction of the theory. There should be nothing that can predict individual forecast errors.
Alex, just to intervene at what, so one question that came in that I think, because I know what's coming, might be useful to just discuss, is the issue of how you measure expectations of different groups. So I know you showed the Michigan, which is clearly a question survey, but there are other groups that people have looked at these tests for, like professionals. So you might want to say a little bit about the formality of forecasting versus just answering a question on a survey. Do you want to say something about that now, just before you
Yeah, so there are indeed different ways in which we can elicit people's expectations. Okay? So broadly, we can ask people how they form their expectations in surveys. So we can field surveys to consumers, field surveys to firms, or field surveys to professional forecasters. And we can see how they answer these questions, how they form their expectations in these questions. Okay? Now, you can do this both incentivized, as if I will give you some money, depending on how you answer the question, or we can do it in a non-incentivized manner. Okay. Now, there is no systematic reason for why a consumer or firm should lie. So maybe you can get a low response rate. Maybe not everyone, when you get the envelope through your door, is going to fill out the survey. But conditional on the people filling out the survey, it's not that they're going to systematically lie one way or the other. And then what you can also do is you can just directly go in the lab. You can run experiments where you pay people depending upon the accuracy of their expectations. And you can see whether the findings that you find from these experiments align with the findings that you find in the surveys. Okay? And now I'm brushing over a lot of detail, right? But from a as if these two sources of information paint the same picture of the expectation formation process, there's not a lot of discrepancies in the surveys that we elicit and how people form their expectations in these surveys compared to some of the experimental evidence that we see. Okay? There will always be differences, but in terms of magnitudes and sometimes in terms of directions, but in terms of kind of the broad picture that we get on how people form their expectations, I think from my personal perspective, it's remarkable how well these two align. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to look at these different surveys. And this is the gamma coefficient. And here the slide is unfortunately cut off. It was this delta coefficient from before. And under full information rational expectations, if we look at a bunch of different surveys, they should all be scattered around this 0, 0. Okay? So that's where full information rational expectation should be. But when we actually go look at survey data, we can see that we should have already, we don't really cluster around 0, 0. We cluster in this top left-hand quadrant, right? And what we can see is that historically, these older models of expectation formation that we considered, they didn't say we should be at 0, 0. They said you should be somewhere either in this positive quadrant or in this negative quadrant. But it seems that we're in neither place. We're in this top left-hand quadrant where we have a negative gamma coefficient and a positive delta coefficient. So what does it mean to have a negative gamma coefficient? Well, that basically means that when inflation is high, people are forming too high expectations of inflation in the future. And when inflation is low, they're forming too low expectations of an inflation in the future. It is as if people don't completely fully internalize the fact that when inflation is high today, it is all else equal likely to subside tomorrow. Okay? So when inflation is, say, 10% today, I'm going to forecast that inflation is also going to stay at 10% tomorrow and not going to subside. Okay? It's kind of a notion that there may be some extrapolation in the system. There may be some kind of over response to the current state. The fact that this delta coefficient is positive means that there seems to be some of this averaging of noise happening so that we kind of under respond to the average information that we receive between two periods, which would be consistent with this notion that there would be some noise in the information that we have, that somehow when you average my forecast with your forecast, you're going to get a more precise answer. Okay? So this is just a regression coefficient showing that at the individual level, just focus here on this fourth column here. you can see that when you look at the correlation between an individual person's forecast error and the individual forecast revisions, you see a lot of negative coefficients, which again is consistent with this fact that people seem to sometimes overreact to information in this case. But as we saw here, there are other times there's some underreaction to information that happens at other moments. So there is indeed some kind of like over and under reactions which are happening at the same time. Okay. So to summarize, and when we look at the data on these surveys of expectations that we have, and also when we look at the laboratory, when we look at the lab, we see that sometimes agents overreact to new information. Okay, so they could overreact to some particular piece of news that they receive, like for instance, realized inflation or past realized inflation, or they could underreact to other pieces of information that they receive. Okay? But that on average, we seem to indeed overreact to information. There seems to be some overreaction to underreaction to information at the average level. But at the individual level, we could sometimes overreact and sometimes underreact. And here I've just written down some more modern models, which are going to be consistent with both types of, which can be consistent with either. Okay? So models where we have some kind of noisy information can be consistent with these average under responses. Models that have some sort of overconfidence in our information could be consistent with over responses, overreactions. And then other behavioral models can be consistent with either. But what we really need is some unified theory of over and under responses that are consistent with the data. Okay. Now, what I've listed here is just a bunch of more recent models. Okay? So I don't want to go into detail with this, but it's just to show how we can use this survey data to discriminate between them. Okay? So these are different models that have built upon the rational expectation hypothesis, changed it to be more consistent with the data. But what we can see is that while for instance, the first one here gets the delta coefficient right, that this was positive, it gets that the beta coefficient should equal 0 and that the gamma coefficient should be positive rather than negative. So we can use survey data to help shrink the field that we're playing at to help find out what is actually the right model of expectations, what ingredients should we have. And here I've just listed some of the most popular recent models. So component-based limited attention, diagnostic expectations, models of extrapolation, or models of noisy rational expectations. And you can see how we can use the regressions that I showed you to help discriminate between different models to help tell us which of these models, which of these theories is actually the best at explaining the data. Okay. Now, recently, there's been a huge growth in the amount of evidence that we have, and hence our ability to shrink in the field at which you're playing at, shrink in the kind of sets of different models of expectation information that we consider. Okay? So there have been models of how people look at the salience of different information. Okay? So when I think about my own childhood, I can remember what my grandmother cooked for me when I was 7, the same way that I can remember what I ate yesterday. Okay? Information are just more salient than others, and certain experience is just more salient than others. At the same time, there are also certain type of economic narratives that just seem to be more potent for households. Okay? So households, for instance, often think that high inflation, and high unemployment go together, right? Whereas in the data, it's not so clear. So it seems that the models that people have are slightly different. If you look at households and firms, so maybe we need to have different models of expectation information. Almost a deluge of additional evidence about how people's form their expectations. And what we're in the process of now is trying to condense this information into kind of some summary statistics that we can use to discriminate between different models of expectation information. Okay. So let me just kind of close on one way to think about an organizational device that we could use to help discipline all of this evidence that we now have on how people form their expectations. Now, in order to form my expectations, I need to do 3 things. Okay? I need to select what kind of information sources I pay attention to. I need to say, okay, this is the bit of information that I want to have, or this bit of information that I want to pay attention to. Then I need to decide on the weights on these different bits of information. For instance, in the model of my mom that forms her belief about inflation, her weight on the inflation target announced by the central bank is like 100%. She just believes inflation is always going to be 2%, no matter what actual inflation is. Okay? And then ultimately what you're going to do is you have these different sources of information and you're going to combine them and ultimately what you're going to get is some expectation. And what we have so far is we have different models of each of these levels, each of these steps that we need to take in order to create expectations. So we have models of limited attention. We have models where people are uncertain about the optimal use of information. And we have models in which people put too much weight on one source or the other due to either salience or because they feel this particular economic narrative speaks to them very much. But what we're missing so far is kind of like one model which goes through this entire hierarchy and creates this kind of unified framework of how to create expectations, where people first select on the information source, then decide how much to use it, and then ultimately combine it. Okay. Now, to summarize, so what we have today is we have lots of models, we have lots of evidence. So the question is, how do we do model selection in this environment? And I propose some regressions that we can use to discriminate. But it's clear that we are going to have so much evidence, so many statistics, that the question of how to discriminate in models where there's lots of evidence is a big question. Okay? Now, you can always go with like Occam's razor, that what we really want is the simplest hypothesis possible to explain the data. But there are trade-offs. Okay? Particularly, there's a trade-off that I can always make your model fit slightly better by including an additional element, but that makes the model and hence less tractable, and hence yes, useful for macroeconomics as a whole. Okay? So at this state we're currently in, we have lots of interesting models, but the question of how to do this model selection when we have all of these different models and all of this different data is a question that's open, and that's the question I guess that most of us are struggling with today. Okay? So let me just finally say that considerable attention has been devoted to survey and experimental data on expectations and what they can tell us about different models of expectation formation. And the recent increase that we saw in inflation expectations and inflation itself will only amplify this tendency. But the big question that we have in our field today in behavioral macro is, how do we do model selection and evaluation in environments where we have so much evidence on how people's form their beliefs? And then I will just close on this quote from Lewis, 1989. And he said, in terms of macroeconomic or microeconomic consequences, having households which are almost rational, so which look a little bit like these full information rational expectations households, but not exactly like a full information rational expectation households, can lead to very different microeconomic and hence macroeconomic dynamics from fully rational households. So that's all I had to say for today. So thank you for your time and attention.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alex. Okay. There will, if you have questions from the audience, please put them in the Q&A. But otherwise, I'm going to ask you some follow-up, some building on some of this material. So let me start with building on the question I asked halfway through about how we measure it. It strikes me, and as someone who used to work in central banks, your mother seems like the ideal person to have in society, both trusting and understanding. But we know that not everybody understands the concept of inflation. So how much of a problem do you think that is in getting them to elicit views on it?
Yeah, so I think that's a very good question. So sometimes when we ask people about inflation, it's not clear. So I, as a household, should care about the inflation index that I face, right? And not about the aggregate inflation index. So when I make my consumption and saving choices, what I should care about is the inflation index that I face, not the aggregate inflation index. So the question is basically, how much heterogeneity, how much differences are there in different inflation indices? Okay? And potentially there could be differences, and that should lead us to different conclusions. But I think, first of all, the evidence is that for a large share of the population, there's not actually that much heterogeneity in different inflation indices. Okay, the behavior of the indices over time. So that's the first thing. And the second thing that one can do is one can always look at these professional forecasters. Okay? So professional forecasters, they are trained economists who are working, their livelihood is how to form expectations. Okay? And they can then serve as this lower bound that we can have from deviations from full rationality. Okay? Presumably, these are the agents in the economy that have the best expectations about the future state of the economy, right? So they can be used to benchmark deviations and say, okay, maybe this is like the best expectations that we have in the economy at every given state at the moment. We can look at how far are they then from rational, and then we would know that households and firms are somewhat more kind of irrational than these professional forecasters. And when we look at survey evidence, that's actually exactly how it seems. It does seem indeed that, professional forecasters provide the most rational forecast. Large firms then provide forecasts which look a little bit in between rational forecasts, and then households and smaller firms look a little bit like households. So
Okay.
I
Oh,
think we
sorry.
can kind of span the different answers in this way.
Okay. So, but then going to the, there's a follow-up question which we'll come into in a second. But I guess following on from that, you presented a lot of different types of models that people could have to form their expectations, and the model selection idea was, well, what does the data say looks most consistent? I guess if I was just caring about the individual, you could have individual data, and you touched on this a bit with, I think it was the table from the Bordello paper. Individuals, you and I could form our expectations in different ways, right? I could have backward-looking expectation formation. So why do we prefer thinking about what works best in the aggregate than we do about what matters for each individual?
So I think, I mean, first of all, it's not that I think we should care about what matters for each individual. Like ultimately, the long run goal. I mean, if we could have models of individual, we could form. I could have one model, you could have one model, and we could all form it together in a coherent manner for the aggregate economy. That would be a great advance. But that is computationally because it's not. These are models which are not feasible to solve. And ultimately, what we do need is we need to construct some policy counterfactuals. And these policy counterfactuals will depend upon whatever model that we've put in of the average expectation and how that's formed in the economy. Okay? So in terms of kind of like macro outcomes, what we care about is some notion of the average expectation that's formed in the economy. And now it's not clear that you and I carry the same weight in the macroeconomy, right? As we consume different amounts, you have higher consumption than me, your expectation for aggregate consumption is going to matter more than mine. So that means that, in this average, maybe we should tilt and focus more on kind of like your model of expectation formation. But I think I see this as it's one step, right? The ultimate goal would be to have, the exact model of expectation as accurately modeled as we could of every individual. But that's not where we're at. And it seems like in order to get just the ballpark of these counterfactuals that we run with policy correctly, looking at how average expectations are formed in the economy is one approach that is like the natural starting point to take.
Okay. And actually, what you were saying there actually leads nicely into Mansi's question, which is, do you see evidence on people responding to their expectations? So changing consumption or whatever. And does it matter at an aggregate level? So this is like an extrapolation of your answer with my question into what's the behavior for these aggregate things?
Yeah, so recently, indeed, we've seen more and more surveys of expectations which have been connected to actual individual decision making. And what you can see is kind of at a broad picture, like kind of makes sense. Okay, so people who expect higher inflation, they have more real assets, less nominal assets. People who expect higher real interest rates save more. So it does seem that people indeed respond with their economic choices to the expectations that we're eliciting. Clearly, this is going to be noisy, but there's a huge gap between noisy and containing little information, right? So I think, of course, survey evidence is always going to be slightly noisy, but the fact that we can see connections between this survey evidence and real economic choices at the individual level means that what we're eliciting seems to have like some actual real economic implications.
Okay, so I'm going to potentially draw you somewhere you don't want to go, but I'll try anyway. Um, one group that I know respond to forecasts, and they form their forecasts in a way that is very consistent with the models that we have in macro, are central bank policymakers, right? For an inflation targeting central bank, they think a lot about where inflation is going to go. And if it's going to be too high, they're going to raise rates to try and bring it down. If it's too low, they'll lower rates to try and bring it up. Has anyone looked at their evidence on whether they also overreact to certain bits of information? Is there a sort of a widespread evidence on whether they look like the center of your plot with the zero
So
rational?
I think the way to, there's probably a difference between, this is me conjecturing, the internal model-based models of expectations that central banks produce, which probably will look a lot like some of the very rational agents that we're trying to model. And then ultimately the forecasts that are being released by the central bank, which is subject to this kind of judgment component. Okay? So some of the evidence that I've seen on how central bank on these ultimate forecasts are being released seem that these central banks suffer from the same kind of like sluggishness that aggregate expectations do, and that they also occasionally sometimes overreact to information. Okay, so they look different from professional forecasts, like that we can say, but it's not as if they look 100% rational as one may otherwise expect. Okay, so I think what's happening is that the forecasts serve a dual purpose. One is that they just provide directly a forecast of the economy, and that helps households and firms form their own expectations, okay, in a very kind of like cost-efficient manner. Could listen to what the central bank says, and then I could try to form my own beliefs based on that. But on the other hand, they're also providing like forward guidance, or they're providing some guidance about how they would like the economy to behave in the future. It becomes a tool for policy itself. And I think sometimes the reason that why we're seeing these central bank forecasts not behaving in the rational, no predictability of forecast eras is that there's a tension between these two objectives, which can happen, right? Between just providing the best forecast and then helping to say stimulate the economy or contract the economy.
Okay, so now onto the politics of inflation. You alluded to it at the start that the last couple of years of with the resurgence in inflation has seen a lot of sort of political implications. Um, do you think that when we as macroeconomists think about inflation, we need to think a bit more about the political economy? Of course, the founding subject was political economy, not economics. Do you think we need to go back there a bit, or what's your view on how what you talked about today relates to
I think that is probably very correct. I think um, personally, I used to think, before this rise in inflation, that inflation was kind of a nice thing because we had measured expectations of it, but it was a variable that throughout my life has been remarkably constant. So it was not clear to me why I should care about this to a large extent. Okay? Then we saw a rise in inflation, and I know the textbooks, I know the economic costs that are associated with this rise in inflation. But one thing that surprised me was just the extent to which it's polarized, has led to polarization of economic opinion, but also just to the extent that this is actually what gets people to vote for one way or the other. Like if you ask people in the US election, what was their primary reason to vote one way or the other? It was often questions about economy, and it was often questions about prices that were like at the forefront of their voting behavior. And if we look at different components of the CPI, of the price index, we also see that it's not all price increases are alike in terms of like driving voting behavior. There are certain price increases like prices for fuel or prices for food, these basic necessity goods that we consume very regularly and for which the prices are very salient. And rises in these prices really feel like they're changing our economic environment quite drastically, leading to very large shifts in voting behavior. And I think that we as a field have not fully internalized these kind of political economy implications that it can have on the macroeconomy. So I think we have like good models of the cost of inflation for, say, moderate increases. But for me, like when it becomes very large, it seems like we're missing something about how corrosive inflation is to society as a whole.
Yeah, well, just to reiterate that, I mean, you and I share a course. We, for those listening, we teach the lectures, give the lectures for all of the undergraduates, first years who are taking any economics related subject. So PPE, economics and management, history and economics, and I give the lecture on inflation. And I used to have to really work hard to convince the audience that there were costs to inflation because, like you, and largely like me, most of them had never lived through anything looking at all like a large inflation. And this year and last year, I got to tell them, well, now everyone feels strongly about it. But one of the perhaps striking things to drive home to them is that the inflation that we've just talked about, that was so corrosive in, say, the US elections, UK elections, etc., this is actually still relatively low inflation. I mean, we're talking about we went from 2 to, in the UK, 11, 11 and a half at its peak. I as a kid lived in Zimbabwe, and that country at one point had a hyperinflation that had prices doubling essentially daily. So we're talking millions and millions of percent annual inflation. So it is really striking how non-linear the costs of inflation are, and I think that is definitely something that we should think about. But you mentioned salience, and I guess one other question that always comes up is, and it relates to the political discussions of inflation. is this issue of the role of the media, because you talked about selection of information sources. And for most people, you know, people like myself aside, they don't listen to central bankers speak directly. They don't engage even directly with the National Statistics Agency to look at the data. They derive everything from newspapers, radio, and television. So what do we know of the role that they play in forming this, both salience of information, but I guess also the extent to which we trust different sources? Do you know much about what's going on there, and how would that change my expectation formation model?
Yeah, so the first thing we know is that these media sources do indeed help coordinate people's beliefs on certain things. Okay, so suppose that we're in the case of my two TV stations, right? So that would help us coordinate a lot of beliefs because everyone was watching this. And if they said, inflation is going to be 4%, and this was the only source of news, then you would believe that inflation was indeed 4%. And that's kind of would coordinate people's expectations on this 4% number. Right? And similar, what we see is that when news media are covering certain sectors of the economy, these sectors see a lot of inflows of funds, and these sectors grow. So we see that media indeed does have this potential to coordinate people's opinion on certain particular things. Okay? And that coordination then will help drive, will help drive business cycles and will help drive cycles in inflation, okay? By helping to coordinate people's opinion on one thing or the other. But I think if we look at kind of like the media landscape, that has also been subject to a lot of like heterogeneity that didn't exist before. So we don't no longer just have a couple of media outlets. We have almost with the internet an infinite amount of media outlets, and we're probably all listening to slightly different things. So my view is that this coordinating role that media used to play has probably been lessened. So people are just coordinating, but they're coordinating within their different subgroups. Okay, so we're the Guardian listeners and the Telegraph listeners and the BBC listeners and the, I don't know, GB News listeners, and there are all these different media sources, and we're all slightly coordinating on slightly different things. So probably this ability of media to help drive aggregate cycles by coordinating everyone's beliefs has probably been dampened over time. Now, this doesn't mean it could be that some of these media are leading people to have worse expectations than in the days where there was just the BBC. I'm not making a statement about this, but at least in terms of just being able to coordinate people's beliefs, to have the same beliefs to help generate these aggregate cycles, it seems like that has probably gone down over time.
Okay, and there's a last question that's come in. It's broadly, do you have any book recommendations in relation to this topic? If somebody was not an expert, not a specialist, and wants to get sort of a coverage. I have an answer, but I'm going to let you answer first as well.
You start first while I'm searching my brain.
Okay, so the one I recommend, and I did this on the Economics Observatory website for what to read over Christmas. It's a book written by a friend and colleague of mine in the US. It's called Shock Values, Prices and Inflation in American Democracy, and it's by Carola Binder, who's at UT Austin. It's all about America, so it's very focused on the US, but I think it captures a lot of the ideas of this interrelation between inflation, societal operation, because, one of the things you mentioned, Alex, was that there's this redistribution of wealth. People who have mortgages are supposed to gain from inflation, but most don't feel like it. And I think the reason is that, the cost of my mortgage goes up in the near term, even though the value of my debt has come down. So maybe 5 years later, when my wage has been increased to compensate for inflation and I'm sort of back to where I should be in some sense, I now have less nominal debt and I've gained, but I don't feel it in the moment. It seems like everybody feels it at the time. And that book, I think, talks a lot about that historically, which I recommend. But I hand over to you for the last word on a recommended book.
So Andreas Life and Nicola Giannoli and Pedro Badalo also have a summary paper, a summary book that covers a lot about this, about expectation formation and financial crisis, which is a very good read. It's very easy to read also.
Excellent. Good. I think we're just coming up on the hour. So let us pause it, stop it there. Let me just thank everybody for joining, for putting their questions in the question box. Alex, that was fantastic. Really enjoyed it. And to everybody else, keep your eye out on the website and for the emails for the next in the What Economists Do, Really Do series. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for your time.